Chapter 6. The Conquest of Iran. The first object was to secure the person of the runaway monarch. He had a long start on the royal road, which led from Ecbatana to Iran by way of Regay, not far from Tehran, and the Caspian Gates. The pursuit was one of the greatest efforts and maddest chases that Alexander ever undertook. Enforced marches, reckless of the terrible exertions imposed on man and horse, Alexander followed on Darius's heels, and caught up with him finally beyond the Caspian Gates, not far from Hecatompylos, after a wild ride in which only a small band of cavalry accompanied him. But it was only a corpse that he secured. The satraps of the Iranian provinces, especially Bessus, satrap of Bactria, saw that this broken man had no longer the energy to take up the struggle against Alexander in eastern Iran. First, they put him in chains and took him with them as a prisoner. Then, when Alexander approached, they gave him his death blow, and themselves escaped eastwards. The moment when Alexander stood before the corpse of Darius was one of the great turning points of his life. Even after Issus, he had claimed the Persian Empire by right of the sword, and at Arbela he had been acclaimed by the assembled army as king of Asia. But now that the last Achaemenid had passed away, he regarded himself as his heir and lawful successor on the Persian throne. Whether by official proclamation he communicated to his Persian subjects his succession to the throne, we do not know. But he exhibited himself as the new king immediately, and ordered the burial of Darius with all royal honors alongside of his ancestors at Persepolis. Just as formerly, he had accounted vengeance for the murder of his father, Philip, as his first duty as ruler, so now he appeared in the role of avenger on behalf of the murdered Darius. The rebels who had murdered their royal master were to be duly punished, while those who had been faithful to him were held in high honor. Nevertheless, it was not merely the necessity of vengeance which took him to the far east, against Bessus and his accomplices, in the proud consciousness of being the lawful successor of the great king. He considered it his task to take possession in person of the eastern portion of his gigantic empire. Very different was the impression which the death of Darius made on his Greek and Macedonian entourage, and on his army. These hoped and believed that the war was now at an end, and that they might at last return home. Alexander's first duty was to summon an assembly of the army, and make clear to them the necessity of a further advance. It was quite easy for his fascinating personality to carry the troops away with him. But the fact that an address to them in solemn assembly was necessary at all was the first sign that a rift was beginning to open between the king and his Greco-Macedonian followers, which was destined in the ensuing years to become broader and deeper. They were separated not merely by different ideas of the object for which they were fighting, but above all, by Alexander's conception that he was the successor of Darius on the Persian throne. To be sure, he was still king of Macedonia and also hegemon of the Corinthian League. His Asiatic monarchy, however, involved consequences that were bound in the end to lead to conflict with the Macedonians, who could not endure to see their king an Asiatic sultan. Externally, the new era revealed itself in the fact that Alexander gradually began, though at first only in the presence of his oriental subjects, occasionally to wear Persian royal attire and adopt Persian court ceremonial. It is hard to tell how far he was guided in this by love of pomp and display, which is generally put in the foreground or regarded as his only motive. The determining factor, anyhow, was the new position in which he felt himself towards the Persians and the other peoples of the Asiatic Empire. As their lawful king, he saw in them no longer his enemies, but his subjects. Anyone who fought against him was a rebel against his master, for these subjects, and especially for the Persians, the hitherto dominant nation, their old traditions, monarchic as well as religious, were to be as far as possible preserved, but in return for that, they were to look up to him, as they had done to the Achaemenids, and show their reverence in the same forms. It was the same statesmanlike idea which had already induced him, in Egypt and Babylonia, where he had accepted independent thrones to take over old established traditions and ceremonies. The hearts of the new subjects were thus to be won for the new government, and they were to become a strong support of the new empire. This new attitude to the Persians led gradually to their further employment in the imperial service as time went on. He had already begun to put Persians into the civil post as satraps, but it was a novelty when after a time he began to draft Persians and later Iranians into his army. A measure which was suggested by the obvious fact that he could not execute his gigantic plans with the Macedonians alone, since drafts from home became more difficult. The further he went eastwards, these inevitable military changes led later to the serious conflicts with his Macedonians. It was in July 330 that Darius, at the age of about 50, met with his tragic end. After recruiting his army and giving it some rest, Alexander had as his first task to occupy Hyrcania, the country south of the Caspian Sea. He crossed the lofty range of Elburz and moved into the seaboard plain. It took severe fighting to subject the mountain tribes of the Tapurians and Mardians, the latter of whom had never yet been subject to Persian rule. But on the other hand, many Persian magnates hurried to pay their homage to the new king. The Greek mercenaries, too, about 1,500 strong, who had remained faithful to Darius to the last, asked pardon from Alexander. He had first required unconditional surrender, because they had transgressed the resolution of the Hellenes, that no Hellene should take the Persian pay, and when he received their surrender, he made a distinction. Those who had entered the Persian service before the foundation of the Corinthian League were free to go home. But while he pardoned those who had entered later, he compelled them to continue serving in his army under the same conditions. This proceeding shows that while for the East Alexander was great king, to the Greek League he was hegemon as before. He behaved also as hegemon of the League to the Greek ambassadors at the Persian court, who were then brought before him. He set free the ambassadors of Sinope, because that city did not belong to the Corinthian League, and therefore had the right to send ambassadors to the king. Conversely, he detained the Athenian ambassador, because he was dispatched after the founding of the League. He also had the Spartan envoys imprisoned, but this was because the decision about the vanquished Spartans, which the Synhedrion referred to Alexander, had not yet been taken. If Alexander's stay at the south end of the Caspian Sea reminds us of his position as hegemon, it also displays his tendencies to scientific investigations, which we saw before in Egypt. Apparently he was already occupied with the problem, whether the Caspian was a gulf of the ocean or an inland sea, a problem which he took up at later, just before his death. Geographical problems in overwhelming quantity were forced on Alexander and his suite. When advancing from Zadrakarta, the capital of Hyrcania, he moved into eastern Iran. There he came into regions of which the Greeks had hitherto had either no information at all, or at least very vague ideas. For Greek geography, this Iranian campaign, like the Indian later, was also a voyage of discovery of the highest moment. The territory which Alexander conquered by several years of fighting embraces Bukhara in the north, western Turkestan up to the Sendaria, and in the south Afghanistan and the northern fringe of Baluchistan. This corresponded in the north to the satrapies of Bactria and Sogdiana, in the south to those of Area and Dharangiana, Arachosia, and the Parapamisadai on the Hindu Kush. How erroneously these new regions were linked up with the map of the world as previously known is strikingly expressed in these two particulars. The Saidaria, by the natives called Jaxartes, was supposed to be the upper course of the Tanais, the Don. The boundary river between Asia and Europe, which flows into the Sea of Azov and the Hindu Kush and its spurs, were thought to be a continuation of Caucasus and were styled Caucasus. The Macedonians never heard of the Sea of Avaral, into which the flow of Oxus and Jakartis. A consultation of the map will show how completely wrong was the Macedonian idea of the Earth's surface. According to Strabo, they identified the Jakartis with the Tanais, because fir trees occurred on its further bank, and that tree, they thought, was only to be found in Europe, not in Asia. Perhaps, however, it was Aristotle who led them to this wrong identification. He had associated with the Tanais, the Araxes, as he called the great river, that is either the Oxus or Jakartas, which flows northward from Parnassus, the Hindu Kush. At any rate, Alexander and his people, while they were in eastern Iran, had no conception in what part of the earth they were. Nevertheless, by constant crossing and diagonal marching, which were necessitated by military operations, they acquired a thorough knowledge of the terrain itself, with its lofty mountains and rich plains, its salt deserts and steppes. In the histories of Alexander are very vivid descriptions of landscape, for example, of the sandy steppe between Bactra and the Oxus, or the snowy district between Kandahar and Kabul. The surveyors here were certainly equal to their task, and by their measurings of the road used by the army and their other observations, laid a foundation for complete information about these regions. The fighting in eastern Iran, which now faced Alexander, was the most severe that he had ever had to engage in. It lasted almost 3 years, from the autumn of 330 till well into 327, and not until then could he regard the conquest of these countries as secured. This is astonishing, when one considers that his unparalleled career of victory from the Hellespont to Media needed only 4 years to win the throne of Persia. The difference is due to the different quality and mode of fighting of his antagonists. The Aryan peoples of eastern Iran, especially the Bactrians and Sogdians, had a very highly developed, proud national feeling, and a tenacious enthusiasm for freedom and independence, such as Alexander had found nowhere in the Persian Empire. With the exception of Tyre and a few brave mountain tribes, this national feeling welded them together the more inseparably, because it was inspired by their common Zoroastrian religion. They would hear nothing of submission to the foreign Macedonian, however much he might proclaim that he was marching against Bessus as the avenger and successor of Darius. On the contrary, they saw in Bessus their leader in the national struggle, when he, a kinsman of the Achaemenid house, on his return to Bactria, set the tiara erect upon his head, a right possessed by the king alone, and proclaimed himself as great king under the name Artaxerxes. He soon perished, but they then found in the Sogdian Spetamenes an excellent leader. For more than a year he was the mainspring of the national struggle for freedom, and it was only with his death that their capacity for resistance collapsed. Not only was the quality of the enemy different from before, but their mode of fighting differed. Here in eastern Iran, no great battles were offered to Alexander, such as he had hitherto won, principally by the same method of the oblique battle formation, in which the army he had inherited from Philip was particularly well drilled. It was a genuine people's war which awaited him. The enemy was difficult to get hold of. They never opposed him in large numbers, but as soon as he advanced, they appeared in his rear, if possible in several places simultaneously. They made a fresh rising. They entrenched themselves in inaccessible rocky recesses, or, if in danger, vanished in the Turkoman steppes, only to break out again suddenly and make a surprise attack upon him. How dangerous and exhausting such a guerrilla war may be is shown by the fighting of Napoleon in Spain, in which he was unable to get the upper hand. The great importance of Alexander as strategist and tactician, which has, without justification, occasionally been contested of late, meets us more strikingly in this guerrilla warfare in eastern Iran than in the great pitched battles of the previous years. Here he was faced by quite new tasks which presented new difficulties to his generalship. Let us remind those who would like to give Parmenio all the military credit that during this fighting he was at Ecbatana. Unfortunately, reliable information about Alexander's arrangements is so incomplete that no clear idea can be formed of them. If the army led by Alexander to India was completely different, in numbers and in composition, from that of the first 4 years, the changes must have been partly introduced during the fighting in eastern Iran. besides the considerable accession of mercenaries from Greece and Asia Minor, which we have recorded. One may probably infer from his new attitude to the Persians that he drafted into his army a large number of Persian troops. The great losses of these years demanded extensive recruiting, and the peculiar features of a guerrilla war required a special expansion of light troops and cavalry. Since the Bactrians and Sogdians were admirable horsemen, the heavy-armed Macedonian phalanx could not be utilized at all as a close formation, but only in divisions, and the same applied to the heavy cavalry, who no longer operated as a separate corps. In crossing the snowy Hindu Kush, Alexander's cavalry lost many horses. These were replaced in 329 by the first-rate Sogdian mounts, which made his cavalry more like that of the enemy. The chief object of the changes thus made was speed and greater mobility. To this end, new tactical units were created, in place of the organization, initiated in 331, of the cavalry regiments into 2 squadrons apiece, Lokoi. In 329, he formed Heptarchies, which fell into several subdivisions and embraced riders armed differently, and soon of different nationality. New classes of men-at-arms, borrowed from the Persians, were introduced, such as the mounted javelin men, Hepacontestai, who appear in his army soon after Darius' death, and the mountain archers, Happotoxetai. These are but trifles, yet they give us a glimpse of the gradual transformation of the army. One consequence of the scattered mode of fighting practiced by the enemy was that Alexander was driven to new tactics. He had often to cause his army to advance in separate columns. Different fighting units were grouped under one commander, and the columns thus made capable of independent actions at a moment's notice. In case of need, however, the columns could, by a clever maneuver, be reunited again. As new as the mode of fighting were the measures Alexander took to secure the conquered districts in eastern Iran. On the basis of doubtful statements, it was earlier assumed that he had already founded new cities in Hither Asia, but recent investigation has made it probable that his city foundations in eastern Iran were his first foundations on Asiatic soil. At any rate, they are the first authentically attested foundations of Alexander in Asia, and are not to be confused with previous resettlements of old towns, such as Tyre and Gaza. They were preceded only by one new foundation on African soil, in Egypt. While we excluded a military motive for that, in the case of eastern Iran, it is obvious that the necessity of securing in a military sense this hard-won territory was the occasion and leading motive of the innovation. Of the importance of these foundations in promoting trade and culture, we shall have to treat later. After this general estimate of the campaign in eastern Iran, it is necessary to give a sketch, at any rate in broad outline, of the course of the military operations. In the summer of 330, Alexander moved eastwards from Hyrcania through Parthia, and had reached the northern extremity of Area, when he received the news that Bessus, as has been mentioned, had been recognized in Bactria as king of Asia under the name of Artaxerxes. Satyabarzanes, satrap of Area, had just done him homage, and Alexander was about to hurry by the nearest and direct route to Bactra, but he was obliged instead to push southwards into Area, as Satyabarzanes, on hearing the news, had taken the field for Bessus, and had raised an insurrection there. Again, Alexander gained his object by the amazing rapidity of his operations. By forced marches with part of his army he reached Artacoana, the capital of Area, in 2 days. Satyabarzanes escaped, and the insurrection collapsed. To secure the unruly country, whether then or later is uncertain, Alexander determined to found a Greek city there, Alexandria and Area, Harat. Instead of returning northwards to the road that led directly to Bactria, he next went further south, without meeting with any substantial resistance, into Drangiana, then eastwards to Arcosia, and finally into Parapasamadai, at the southern end of the Hindu Kush. His march seems to have followed the line of the Persian royal road. This great detour southwards to the Helmand gave Alexander no time this winter, 330 to 29, for prolonged winter quarters. His strategic plan no doubt was, after the unpleasant experiences he had had in Area, to occupy the region south of the Hindu Kush, and so prevent their defection to Bessus in his rear. He secured these regions too by founding several cities, as Alexandria and Arcosia, Kandahar and Alexander at the Caucasus. Here a breathing space was granted to the troops, though a column had to be tilled to crush yet another rising in Area. In the spring of 329, after a short rest, he led his army with great labor over the snowy Hindu Kush, and, in spite of the devastation of the territory at its northern end, by which Bessus sought to detain him, made a victorious entry into Bactria. Before his impetuous onset, Bessus escaped over the Oxus, Amodaria, burned his boots, and retired to Nautaka in Sogdiana. Meanwhile, Alexander occupied Bactria, including the capital Bactra, and advanced to the Oxus, which he crossed near Kiev. On account of the lack of wood, it was impossible to build bridges, and it took him 5 days to get his army across. They swam across, supported by inflated leather skins sewn together out of tent coverings, and holding their swimming horses by the bridles. This was, in antiquity, as it is today, a well-known method of crossing a river in the east, and Alexander had already employed it on the Danube. Bessus had lost prestige by retiring without fighting, and soon fell into Alexander's hands. Gradually deserted and betrayed by his troops, and abandoned by his followers. Among them, Spetamenes, the Sogdian, he was easily caught by Ptolemy, later king of Egypt, who was detached with a flying column for this raid. Alexander, who met him as the great king exacting punishment for high treason, had him later condemned to death at Bactra, in the Persian fashion in which Darius I had formerly punished his rivals. His nose and ears were cut off, and he was then sent to Ecbatana, where he was cruelly executed by his equals, by crucifixion or dismemberment. In Spetamenes, however, who now took Bessus's place as leader of the national resistance, Alexander found a much more dangerous antagonist. Alexander now penetrated by way of Samarkand, to the Jaxartes, Sardaria, and thus reached the extreme northeast limit of the Persian Empire. Beyond the river, which the Macedonians, as we saw, identified with the Tanais, in the broad steppes lived the nomad Dahai, Sakai, and Masagatai, who had always been a danger to the empire on this side. As a bulwark against them, Alexander founded on the side of the Jaxartes a Greek city, Alexandria Ascati, Cogent, which was to keep watch on the frontier river. By reason of the endless steeps on the other side, Alexander had no more idea of moving the frontier further north than he had before the Danube. He had here reached the limits of the inhabited world. Oikomane, which is bounded not merely by the ocean, but also by deserts. Nevertheless, as at the Danube, he now made a single victorious advance over the Jaxartes, to inspire these barbarians with respect for his arms. While Alexander was occupied with preparations for the founding of the city, Spetamenes had roused a revolting number of localities in his rear. A severe punishment was meted out to these, when the insurrection had been crushed with much bloodshed. The townships were destroyed, and the inhabitants executed, for Alexander regarded them as rebels against their master. Soon afterwards, the indefatigable Spetamenes succeeded in fomenting a rising on a greater scale in Sogdiana, a rising which was all the more dangerous, because he was supported by the northern nomads. When he began to besiege the Macedonian garrison of Marsadana, Alexander sent an expedition against him, but remained behind to supervise the foundation of his city. Marakanda was relieved, but after retiring into the northern steppe, and obtaining 600 cavalry from the allied nomads. Spitamenes completely defeated and destroyed the expeditionary corps on the Polytametes, and was able to besiege Marcanda again. Thereupon Alexander left the Jacartes, and in person hurried by forced marches to Marcanda with a contingent of light troops. He covered the 180 miles from Khojend to Samarkand in 3 days and a few hours. At the news of Alexander's approach, Spitamenes escaped into the steppe. Alexander followed him to the Polytametes, subdued the northern frontier, and severely punished the rebels. He then led his army back southwards into Bactria and made his winter camp, 329-28, in the capital Bactra. The following year, too, 328, was occupied by vigorous fighting against the insurrections in Bactria and Sogdiana. Part of the army, commanded by Craterus, stayed behind in Bactria. The other part, with which Alexander moved against the Sogdiana, had to be divided into 5 columns to catch the widely dispersed rebels, most of whom had taken refuge in fortresses. After their resistance was broken, the columns united against at Marcanda. While Alexander was still coursing the remnants of the rebels, he caused Hephaestion to plan out several cities in Sogdiana. In the same year, Pharasamenes, king of the Chorasmians, living in the far north, did homage to Alexander, who concluded alliance and friendship with him. In the meantime, Spitamenes, supported by his friends the Massagatai, had made an inroad into Bactria and driven off rich booty from the neighborhood of Bactra. The garrison of the city set out in pursuit after him, but was enticed by Spitamenes into an ambush and defeated his severe loss. Craterus then hurried up and inflicted a severe defeat on him before he could reach the desert. But he made good his escape into the desert again, and before long led a fresh raid into Sogdiana, this time accompanied by 3,000 Massagatai. Meanwhile, Alexander had gone into winter quarters, 328-27, at Nautaka, and had handed over to Coenus the command in Sogdiana. At his hands, Spitamenes suffered a severe defeat, but what sealed his fate was the action of the Massagatai. On the rumor that Alexander himself intended to invade the desert, they betrayed their ally. They cut off his head and sent it to Alexander. With this tragic end of the great hero of Iranian independence, resistance was practically over. Only a last fragment of brave rebels held out in some inaccessible rocky citadels in the southeastern mountains of Sogdiana. In the spring of 327, Alexander marched from Nautaka against the fortress of Ariamazes on the Sogdian rock, which seemed so proof against attack that many of the rebels had deposited their wives and children there, among them the Bactrian prince Oxyartes, once a companion of Bessus. When Alexander summoned them to surrender, they called down to him from above in mockery that he should get flyers for soldiers, for no other could get up to them. Alexander thereupon offered high rewards for the scaling of the highest peak, which overhung the fortress. As it happened, there were 300 bold mountaineers among his Macedonians, who undertook the dangerous feat by night. 30 fell on the ascent, but the rest got up successfully, by the help of ropes and iron tent pegs, which they drove into the ice or hard frozen rock. When in the early morning the besieged saw to their astonishment these Macedonians high above them, they capitulated and surrendered the fortress to Alexander. The fairest prize that fell to him was Roxane, the daughter of Oxyartes, in the first bloom of youth and in the judgment of Alexander's companions, next to Stateria, the wife of Darius, the most beautiful woman that they had seen in Asia. Alexander fell passionately in love with her and determined to raise her to the position of his consort. From here he marched eastwards into the district of Parasantene, against the citadel of Corienes, which, placed high on a steep rock and surrounded by deep ravines, was regarded as impregnable. Alexander, however, set himself undauntedly to the task, in the conviction that nothing was impossible to him and his army. Out of the big pines, which grew on the mountains, he constructed ladders to descend into the ravine, and then by clever engineering succeeded in erecting from above a causeway over the ravine. As soon as Alexander, with his Macedonians protected by penthouses from the enemy's artillery, opened a bombardment from the causeway upon the citadel, Corienes, too, surrendered. He was pardoned and left in possession of his principality. Alexander then returned to Bactra. The difficult task of the conquest of eastern Iran was at an end. The persistence and tenacity of Alexander, which we admired at the siege of Tyre, comes out even more strongly in eastern Iran. He did not leave the country till he had so completely subdued it that he could now safely enlist in his army Bactrians and Sogdians, whose excellent military qualities he had experienced to his cost. This victorious struggle also made such an impression on the peoples of the northern steppes that in future we find Dahai and Sakai in his army too. Before his return to Bactra, Alexander celebrated his marriage with Roxeni up in the castle of Corienes, as we have so very little reliable information upon the sexual side of the king's nature. It is interesting to learn from our best authority, Arrian, that it was love of this fair Bactrian woman which moved him not to treat her as a captive of war, but to make her his lawful wife. In a famous painting, the contemporary artist Etienne represented the marriage of Roxeni as a love scene with many cupids, and we can still get an idea of the famous picture, for it went to Italy, where Lucian saw and described it, and it was from this description that Sodoma made his charming fresco in the Villa Farnesia. The glimpse into Alexander's inner life, which the testimony of Arrian gives us, is all the more valuable, as it is obvious that this marriage had and was meant to have great political importance. The wedding of Alexander to a daughter of Bactria was a gesture of reconciliation with his previous enemies, of a convincing force which even the keenest nationalist among the Iranians could not fail to acknowledge. It was also bound to flatter their national pride that the marriage was performed according to the Iranian ritual. Alexander and Roxeni ate of one loaf, which he served in two with his sword, a custom which prevails to this very day among the natives of Turkestan, with the exception of the sword, which was probably Alexander's spontaneous addition and is just like him. But this marriage with Roxeni meant far more than merely reconciliation with the Eastern Iranians. It also indicates that Alexander's idea of the equality of the Persians and other Iranians with the Macedonians, which had first imposed itself on him as a military necessity, had in these last years of war developed into the thought of a fusion of these two peoples, a thought which in the following years influenced ever more strongly the secret policy which he adopted for his empire. It is only too conceivable that the Macedonians, with steadily growing surprise and dislike, resisted the change in their king, which became more prominent after the death of Darius, for from that time he regarded himself as the latter's lawful successor. Had they incurred these unspeakable toils and battles, merely in the end to look on and see how the despised Orientals were made their equals? Consequently, there soon arose a secret discontent, which on occasion led to violent collisions between the king and his entourage. In the lack of authentic information, it is not quite certain whether the first of the three catastrophes which had happened during these years of war in eastern Iran is attributable to the relations just described, or merely to personal motives, but the former has all the probabilities on its side. It is only certain that in the autumn of 330, while Alexander was still in the capital of Darangiana, there was for the first time a conspiracy against his life. Of its deeper reasons and extent we hear nothing. The whole interest of the writers who allude to it was absorbed in the fact that Philotas, the eldest son of Parmenio and the most brilliant officer in the army, whom Alexander had made commander of his heteroi, was implicated in the trial. Being accused of having taken part in the conspiracy, he was brought before the assembly of the Macedonian army, which was alone competent to judge Macedonians in cases of high treason. When Alexander in person had conducted the prosecution in vehement language, and Philotas had defended himself, the military court condemned Philotas to death, and the execution was immediately carried out in Macedonian fashion, by shooting with javelins. We learn nothing further of the reasons that led to the sentence than that Philotas, though communications had been made to him about the conspiracy, had, in spite of his daily close intercourse with Alexander, given him no warning. The motives of his behavior are not known. If this extraordinary, proud, and ambitious officer expressed himself sharply in criticism of Alexander, then and, as it is said, sometimes even in Egypt, that is not enough to prove his participation in the conspiracy, though it might as an indication influence the judgment of the court. Whether the sentence was just or not, we cannot tell. We must content ourselves with the fact that the military court, which functioned in the regular way, was convinced of his guilt, while Amyantus, son of Andromenes, and his brothers, who, because of their friendly relations with Philotas, were accused before the same court, were able to prove their innocence and were acquitted. If the condemnation of Philotas was a judicial murder, it is not the fault of Alexander, but of the assembly of the Macedonian army. On the other hand, Alexander has the sole responsibility for the sequel in the cruel execution of Parmenio, the father of Philotas. Later sources which state that he too was condemned by the military court falsify history for the benefit of Alexander, and though the conjecture has recently been made that Alexander's action was covered by the special full powers given him by the army to restore his position of security, it lacks all foundation. It is rather the case that Alexander, on his own responsibility, immediately after the condemnation of Philotas, sent orders to Parmenio's subordinates in Media to put him to death, and these orders were immediately carried out. It is the darkest spot in Alexander's life. Here more than ever, we lament the unsatisfactoriness of our authorities, which give us nothing authentic, but simply conjectures as to the motives of the act. And yet, it would be very important for the judgment of Alexander's character to have clear information on the point. He was firmly convinced of the guilt of Philotas. Had he any occasion to assume that the father also was a participator in the conspiracy? This is, as a matter of fact, scarcely credible, when one considers with what loyalty Parmenio served him as the first in his army, just as he had served his father Philip, in spite of the differences of opinion which occurred between them from time to time. Moreover, if Alexander had believed in his guilt, he might have arrested him and had him tried by the army like his son. It is more credible that he was afraid that Parmenio, on the news of his son's execution, which he would naturally regard as unjust, might use the great position which he had entrusted to him in Ecbatana a few months before, to take vengeance, relying on his troops and the imperial treasury, by rising a rebellion attempting to raise against him the western part of Hither Asia. Was it not, in fact, a dangerous situation that the father of the executed man controlled the communications in Alexander's rear? Does not this explain the immense haste with which Alexander sent his messengers, with the secret order of execution, on hunting dromedaries to Ecbatana, in order to anticipate the news of the condemnation of Philotas? There was indeed no other way but death to prevent this news reaching Parmenio. So is probably, as Arrian also indicates, such reasons of state policy which compelled Alexander, as he might rightly or wrongly believe, in the interest of self-preservation and the security of his realm, to put Parmenio to death. Alexander was not deterred from this act by the consequence, which it was easy to foresee, that it would evoke horror and disgust in the whole Greek world, and especially in his army, where Parmenio had been greatly respected, more particularly among the old Macedonians of the school of Philip. On the contrary, he took severe measures when after the deed was done. The displeasure of his Macedonians voiced itself. He picked out the persons in question and formed them into a special company, separated as a punishment from the rest of the army, But this arrangement does not seem to have lasted long. Irritated by the discovery of the conspiracy and by his observation of the signs of discontent in his Macedonian companions, he showed in other ways too that he did not mean to brook opposition. In connection with the conspiracy case, Alexander the Lancestians, who had done him homage at his accession, but had been for the last 3 years a prisoner under suspicion of high treason, was brought before the military court, and by it condemned and executed. 2 years passed, during which Alexander modeled his life more and more after the fashion of a great king. About the autumn of 328, he was in Marcanda after that year's victorious fighting in Sogdiana, and there was again an alarming fracas. Later accounts have colored the facts to suit theories, so that they are difficult to establish in detail. Probably the most trustworthy account is that of Plutarch, which seems to go back to some good and ancient authority in which the facts were plainly stated. According to this account, Alexander, one evening after receiving some fruit from the coast, invited his friends to a symposium. Feeling was already high owing to the heady wine of Turkestan, when, immediately after the singing of a topical song in derision of some Macedonian officer recently defeated, there arose a discussion of Macedonian bravery between Alexander and his friend Cleotus, who had formerly saved his life at the Granicus. In the course of it, Cleotus, annoyed by a personal observation of Alexander's, made a contemptuous allusion to him as son of Ammon, and under the influence of the sweet wine, gave a sudden vent to his long-restrained indignation, and fiercely cast in the king's teeth all that had been weighing on the hearts of his noble companions and himself, the preference shown to the Persians in the adoption of Persian dress, when he finally called out to him that he had better invite barbarians and slaves. Alexander, who also was foregone in liquor, was seized with fury. He threw an apple at Cleotus's head and put out his hand for his dagger, but the bodyguard had carefully placed it out of the way. It appears that Alexander misunderstood this and suspected treason. He shouted in Macedonian for his Hespastus, and ordered the trumpeter to sound the alarm, and when the man had the courage and prudence to disobey, hit him in the face with his fist. To his anger with Cleotus was added rage and excitement at this supposed plot. At this moment Cleotus, whom his friends had succeeded in pushing out of the room, rushed back again by another door to hurl another insult in the king's face. Alexander lost all self-control. He seized a pike from a bodyguard and ran his friend through. Scarcely was the terrible deed done when he collapsed and spent 3 days in the deepest remorse without food or drink. Who, in the face of this sudden eruption of human passion, like to that of natural forces, can judge which side is the more to blame? The two friends who contended with each other were really not the two men. Rather, they were two different views of the world, which exploded with elemental violence. The horrible scene illuminates for us, as with a lightning flash, the state of feeling which had been silently produced among the Macedonian followers of Alexander by the change in his conception of his royal position. By the unrestrained recriminations of Cleotus, Alexander too must have been for the first time enlightened on the psychological effects of his policy upon the Macedonians. But this did not result in his altering his views. He never thought of concession or even of compromise. His aims and the means and ways which led to them were for him fixed and immovable. He must now have seen more clearly than ever that he could not climb the steep road to world sovereignty without conflicts with his Macedonians. And all the more he must have felt it essential to rely on the Persians and the other Iranians, in spite of Alexander's passionate remorse, which had no reference to the underlying cause of the collision. The catastrophe of Cleotus had rather the opposite effect. Alexander adhered the more stubbornly to a policy of which the Macedonians disapproved, and immersed themselves still deeper in the ideas of an assimilation between victors and vanquished. The idea of a fusion of the nations, which had perhaps suggested itself to him before, developed in his mind, and a few months afterwards, in the spring of 327, found for the first time its visible expression in his marriage with Roxanne. As a corollary of this, immediately after his return to Bactra, he attempted to introduce the Persian prosynesis among his Macedonians and Greeks. Since primeval times, it had been an oriental practice for the subjects of a king to greet him by throwing themselves on the ground. It probably did not imply a recognition of the king as god. It was merely a sign of the most complete subjection to an absolute ruler. This custom of prosynesis, as the Greeks called it, which was introduced by Cyrus, the founder of the empire, and applied to the Persians as well as to his other subjects, was always regarded by the Greeks, as soon as they came in contact with it, as something particularly contemptible and quite specially oriental. The free Greek could abase himself before his god, but never before a man, and thus the observation of the custom may have contributed to the error, which appears as early as Aeschylus, that the Persians worshipped their kings as gods in their lifetime. Alexander certainly knew from his Persian courtiers that the Persians regarded the prosynesis simply as an expression of the deepest reverence for their lord, but as he was naturally familiar with the Greek conception, it was a dangerous undertaking to promote the leveling of his subjects by an attempt to establish among Macedonians and Greeks a custom which the Persians followed in his case as a matter of course. We must decidedly reject the view that he meant indirectly to force his recognition as a god, for later on, he required the obeisance only of the Greeks and not of the Macedonians. His purpose rather was to express the equal position of the Persians with the Macedonians and Greeks by means of this common court ceremonial. It was a step which went far beyond anything he had previously done in this direction. Perhaps he would not have undertaken it, had there not been at his court in his immediate circle individuals who were ready in this matter to go with him through thick and thin. In particular, his closest friend, Hephaestion, seems to have been the stage manager. How conscious they were of the danger of the experiment is shown by the caution with which it was presented. It was agreed that at a symposium the king should drink out of a cup to the friends who were in the plot one after the other, and that each should drain the cup, fall down before him, and then exchange with him the kiss of friendship, also a Persian custom. At first all went according to plan, but when it came to Callisthenes' turn, he, surprised by the suggestion of making the prosynesis, omitted it. Alexander had turned to Hephaestion. When his attention was drawn to the omission, he refused to kiss Callisthenes, who thereupon defiantly called out to him, "Well, I go away with the poorer by a kiss." The evening thus ended with an unpleasant incident. But what finally induced Alexander to give up his design was not so much the refusal of Callisthenes as the realization that on this point his old Macedonians would stubbornly resist him. We do not hear that in later years he again required the prosynesis from them. It is to the king's credit that he saw he had been too hasty in his attempts, and did not hesitate to give way. The West was to be spared this Eastern ceremony for many years. It was not till Diocletian that it was introduced along with other Oriental court customs. It was the more surprising that Callisthenes opposed the king in this matter, as in his book he was unbounded in his glorification of him, and had even most vigorously supported his divine sonship. Nor had the change of his pan-Hellenic hero into a great king apparently disturbed his personal relations with Alexander. After the murder of Cleotis, he was one of those who sought to comfort his distracted monarch. His resistance to the prosynesis did not so much imply a protest against the deification of Alexander, such as is formulated in the language ascribed to him, but as probably to be explained on the ground that he saw in it a barbaric and ridiculous mode of reverence, by which the free Greek was depressed to the level of the barbarians he despised. His tie with Alexander was irremediably broken, and the king hated him, since now he was regarded as head of the opposition. Soon afterwards, a new conspiracy was detected among the royal pages. This time the reason was not political, but purely personal. The wounded honor of young Hermolus, whom Alexander had caused to be chastised in front of the other pages, because he had shot a wild boar before him at a hunting party. Though the conspiracy was in itself more harmless than the first, it was yet more dangerous, for these pages waited on the king's person and intended to kill him at night when sleeping. If on the night agreed upon Alexander had not stayed till morning in a symposium, as was said, by the warning of a Syrian prophetess, he would have been lost. The conspiracy was discovered the next day. The pages, as sons of Macedonian nobles, were brought before the military court, and on their confession, condemned to death and executed by stoning. Callisthenes had been tutor to many of them and in close relations with them. In Alexander's mood towards him, the suspicion was natural that he had known of the conspiracy or even instigated it. Alexander had him arrested and an inquiry instituted. As Callisthenes was a Greek, there was no question of trying him by the Macedonian army. Alexander's first thought was to send him before the court of the Sanhedrion at Corinth. This information is valuable, because it again shows that Alexander still looked on himself as being for the Greeks hegemon of the Hellenic League. But subsequently he abandoned the idea, and after taking Callisthenes with him for months as a prisoner, he had him condemned and executed by a private court in India. It is beyond doubt that Alexander believed in his guilt, for Ptolemy and Aristobulus both maintained that he was the instigator of the plot. Yet his guilt was not judicially proven, and is difficult to accept. In the Greek world, which regarded his execution as the judicial murder, Alexander was sorely compromised by his condemnation. The excitement in the peripatetic school, which counted the Callisthenes as one of its adherents, was particularly acute. Theophrastus gave vent to his grief for the tragic end of his friend in a treatise, Callisthenes, or On the Morning, in which he stated that Alexander did not understand how to make a right use of his good fortune. The Peripatetics thus initiated the unfavorable estimate of Alexander as a tyrant intoxicated by his power and dazzled by his luck, an estimate which was developed ever more incisively in succeeding histories. On the other hand, the relation between Alexander and Aristotle, who, as uncle and teacher of Callisthenes, must have been very closely affected, was in spite of this incident only temporarily, if at all, disturbed. They continued to correspond and exchange ideas. A consecutive treatment of the catastrophes that took places in eastern Iran, from the trial of Philotas to the trial of Callisthenes, such as has been given to bring out the principles that connect them, might easily display too gloomy a picture of the relation of Alexander to his army, if one envisages the military events of 330 through 327, which ended in extremely difficult suppression of the national resistance of eastern Iran, and one sees that in the teeth of everything Alexander succeeded in keeping a tight hand on his army, officers, and men alike. On the march and in battle he was just the same as ever. He was the king of the Macedonian nation, who shared with them the unspeakable fatigues and the hunger and thirst of this guerrilla warfare. Moreover, we have anecdotes from these years, which perhaps cannot be taken as historical, but which obviously illustrate correct impressions, and they show us with what humanity Alexander cared for his people amid personal sacrifice and privations. That was why they followed him with enthusiasm.